1948, a young geochemist embarked on a mission to measure the true age of our planet. He expected a routine calculation of uranium decay in ancient meteorites. Instead, he stumbled into a silent, omnipresent poison that masked the foundations of geological time. This was the start of an accidental, lifelong crusade. Claire Patterson worked in a basement laboratory at the University of Chicago, surrounded by coal dust and industrial debris. Every attempt to measure lead in his samples returned wildly inconsistent, sky-high values. The toxic metal was bleeding into his experiments from some unseen, ghostly source. The environment itself seemed to be conspiring against him. To solve this mystery, Patterson realized he had to construct something entirely unprecedented in scientific history. He built the world's first ultra-clean laboratory, sealing out every microscopic speck of external dust. Clad in sterile protective suits, he waged a private war against an invisible, airborne invader. His obsession with absolute purity began to look like madness. Within this sterile sanctuary, Patterson finally isolated the pristine cosmic specimens untouched by terrestrial contamination. By measuring the ratios of lead isotopes, he unlocked the solar system's deepest secret. The Earth was 4.55 billion years old. Yet, his triumph was immediately overshadowed by a terrifying new mystery. If the natural baseline of lead in the environment was actually near zero, why was it everywhere else? Outside his sealed sanctuary, the toxic metals saturated the soil, the water, and the air. Patterson realized that humanity was breathing in a synthetic poison at unprecedented levels. The industrial world was living inside a massive, unacknowledged experiment. The suspect was not shrouded in shadow. It was proudly advertised on every city street corner. Tetraethyl lead had been added to gasoline since the 1920s to stop engine knocking. It was a miracle of modern engineering that transformed automobiles into symbols of freedom. But this modern marvel harbored an ancient, neurotoxic legacy. For decades, the public had been assured that low-level lead exposure was entirely harmless. Corporate scientists, backed by immense oil revenues, maintained that lead was a natural component of the environment. Anyone who questioned this consensus was dismissed as an alarmist. Patterson, armed with his clean room data, resolved to challenge this multi-billion-dollar empire. His journey began with a search for untainted baseline data far from industrial civilization. He needed to prove that the massive amount of lead in modern humans was not natural. He turned his eyes to the deepest oceans and the polar ice sheets. The crusade would consume his career and his sanity. Patterson designed custom bronze vessels to plunge deep into the silent currents of the Pacific Ocean. He sought to compare the lead concentrations in deep, ancient waters with those at the surface. What he discovered was chilling. The surface waters, exposed to atmospheric fallout, contained vastly more lead than the pristine depths. Next, he journeyed to the desolate, wind-swept ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica. There, the snow fell in annual layers, trapping the atmospheric chemistry of centuries past like pages in a frozen ledger. Patterson and his team dug deep shafts into the blue ice to extract core samples. They were uncovering a timeline of greed. The analysis of the polar ice cores yielded a terrifying historical timeline of atmospheric pollution. Lead levels began to rise during the Roman Empire, when lead smelting was common. Then, the graph spiked vertically, exploding upward after the introduction of leaded gasoline in the 1920s. The evidence of global contamination was written in the ice. Armed with this undeniable evidence, Patterson published his findings, expecting the scientific community to react with alarm. Instead, he was met with a wall of cold, calculated resistance. The lead industry, led by powerful petrochemical corporations, immediately went on the defensive. They recognized Patterson not as a seeker of truth, but as an existential threat. At the center of this corporate defense was Dr. Robert Kehoe, a charismatic toxicologist funded by the petroleum industry. Kehoe had spent decades shaping public policy, asserting that lead in the blood was normal. He championed the idea that unless a worker showed acute symptoms of poisoning, no harm was being done. He was the architect of institutional denial. Kehoe's doctrine was simple. If you cannot prove a specific dose causes immediate death, it is safe. For decades, this philosophy protected the profits of lead producers while poisoning generations of children. Patterson's data shattered this illusion by proving that modern humans had thousands of times more lead in their bodies than their ancestors. The backlash against Patterson was swift, systematic, and devastatingly professional. His research contracts with the Public Health Service were suddenly terminated without explanation. The petroleum industry pressured university administrators to silence him, aiming to strip him of his academic sanctuary. He found himself increasingly isolated, viewed as a liability by his own colleagues. He was excluded from prestigious government advisory panels on environmental health, replaced by industry-friendly consultants. Powerful lobbyists worked behind closed doors to paint Patterson as an eccentric fanatic. Yet, the loss of funding and academic exile only hardened his resolve. He knew that the silent poison was altering the brains of millions of children. Lead is an insidious neurotoxin that mimics calcium, slipping past the blood-brain barrier with ease. Once inside, it disrupts the delicate electrical storms of the developing brain, permanently lowering intelligence and increasing impulsivity. Patterson was fighting not just for environmental purity, but for the cognitive destiny of the human race. The stakes could not be higher. Patterson began a relentless public speaking campaign, taking his message directly to the people. He spoke in drafty town halls, to community groups, and to any journalist willing to listen. He explained how lead from tailpipes settled into the soil where children played. His voice was steady, fueled by a quiet, unshakable rage against corporate indifference. The conflict reached a dramatic climax in 1966 during a series of landmark Senate hearings. Senator Edmund Muskie convened a subcommittee to investigate air pollution, bringing the battle into the political spotlight. For the first time, Claire Patterson and Robert Kehoe would face each other in a direct, public confrontation. The future of public health hung in the balance. Robert Kehoe took the stand first, projecting an aura of calm, authoritative expertise. He repeated his long-held assertions that leaded gasoline was essential to modern transport and posed no public health risk. He argued that Patterson was a mere geologist, unqualified to speak on matters of human medicine. The senators listened, seemingly swayed by his polished credentials. Then, Patterson took the microphone, his hands weathered from years of field research. He did not present slick corporate slides, but raw, irrefutable geochemical data. He demonstrated how his clean room techniques had revealed a global catastrophe that medical science had missed. He argued that the present high levels of lead in human bodies were entirely artificial and dangerous. The hearings marked a pivotal turning point in the public consciousness regarding industrial pollution. Patterson's testimony exposed the severe conflict of interest inherent in industry-funded science. The media began to question the validity of corporate-sponsored safety claims. The myth of safe lead was starting to crack, exposing the dark underbelly of progress. Despite the public breakthrough, Patterson's personal life became a gauntlet of intimidation and paranoia. He reported being followed by unidentified men in dark suits, and his home telephone line crackled with static. He believed his mail was being opened and his movements monitored. The corporate empire he challenged was not going to vanish quietly. Even as his colleagues turned away out of fear for their own funding, Patterson refused to back down. He spent his dwindling resources analyzing consumer goods, finding lead in everything from food cans to plumbing. He realized that the industrial appetite for the toxic metal was deeply woven into modern life. He was fighting a hydra with endless heads. In 1970, the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency took notice of the overwhelming body of independent research. They proposed a phase-out of leaded gasoline, sparking a desperate, decade-long legal war waged by the petroleum lobby. Patterson stood as the chief scientific witness, enduring relentless character assassination on the witness stand. The legal battles dragged on for years, a grueling war of attrition designed to exhaust Patterson's spirit. The industry filed lawsuits, demanded endless review panels, and attempted to suppress scientific reports. But the mountains of data Patterson had compiled were too robust to be buried. The truth was slowly, but surely, grinding down the corporate defense. By the mid-1980s, the phase-out of leaded gasoline was finally completed in the United States. Almost immediately, the result of this monumental shift became visible in public health data. Average blood lead levels in American children plummeted by over 80% within a decade. Patterson's lonely, decades-long crusade had saved millions from brain damage. Yet, this monumental victory brought Patterson little personal glory or peace. He remained a marginal figure in mainstream science, often denied the awards and recognition bestowed upon far less controversial researchers. The scientific establishment, which had largely abandoned him during his darkest hours, preferred to forget its own complicity. He retired to his quiet laboratory, a weary victor. Patterson spent his final years reflecting on the broader implications of his life's work. He warned that the battle against lead was merely a single skirmish in a much larger war. He realized that modern industrial society was built on the unchecked release of thousands of synthetic chemicals, none of which had been proven safe. His health began to fail, his lungs weakened by severe asthma, a cruel irony for a man who fought for clean air. He lived out his remaining days in relative obscurity, watching the world slowly clean up his targeted poison. He had sacrificed his career, his academic reputation, and his peace of mind to save a world that barely knew his name. Claire Patterson passed away in 1995, leaving behind a legacy that is measured in the silent absence of poison. Because of his work, billions of people born after the 20th century have healthier, unimpaired brains. He proved that one meticulous mind, armed with uncompromising truth, can bend the arc of history. He was a true martyr of the modern scientific age. Patterson's story stands as a dark warning for the future of scientific inquiry. It asks what other toxic realities we are ignoring today in the name of economic necessity. Science demands a sacrifice, but it also offers the ultimate tool for redemption. In the end, only those willing to stand alone can truly save us from ourselves.